From the outside, Alejandro's mansion looked like a dream sculpted from light and stone. The sun glistened against tall glass doors that stretched like mirrors into the sky, and the sprawling gardens bloomed with roses so perfectly aligned they seemed painted onto the earth. A shimmering pool lay still, reflecting the brilliance of the late morning sun, a symbol of wealth and order. To anyone who passed by, this house was the picture of a man who had conquered life. Alejandro, the self-made millionaire, was known in the city for his sharp mind, his flawless reputation, and his ability to turn everything he touched into gold. The mansion stood as proof of his victories. But within its cold marble halls, behind the velvet curtains and polished chandeliers, lived a silence that no riches could mask. A silence not of peace, but of something far heavier, darker, and more suffocating. Inside that silence was a child's muffled sobs. Little Sophia, Alejandro's only daughter, sat trembling near the corner of the grand living room. Her small hands gripped tightly onto the sleeves of Maria, the maid who had only been in the household a few months. Sophia was no ordinary child. She had been born with Down syndrome. Though her father adored her, his constant travels left her, vulnerable to the moods of those he trusted to care for her. And not all of them saw her as a blessing. On this particular morning, her stepmother Elena towered above her, her voice rising like the crack of a whip. Dressed immaculately in pearls and pressed silk, Elena looked every bit the perfect wife to the outside world. But her eyes burned with cold fire, and her words cut sharper than any blade. "You never learn, do you?" she hissed, pointing an accusing finger at the little girl, as though a spilled toy or an innocent mistake were crimes unforgivable. Sophia's wide brown eyes, usually full of wonder, shimmered with tears. Her cheeks glistened, red from crying, her lips trembling with the effort to hold back sobs that could not be silenced. She was only a child, yet in her short years she had already learned what fear felt like when it came from the very person meant to protect her. Maria, the maid, tightened her arms around the girl, shielding her as though her embrace could block every cruel word. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her face remained steady. She had seen Elena's cruelty before, had heard the sharpness of her tone, had noticed the absence of tenderness, but never until today had she dared to stand in direct defiance. Sophia clung to her desperately, her tiny hands curling into Maria's dress, her sobs soft but piercing. For Maria, this was no longer just about employment or duty. This child reminded her too much of her own younger brother, born with the same condition, whom she had once fought to protect from the world's unkindness. She would not let harm reach Sophia, not while she had breath left in her body. And it was in this very moment, this fragile collision of cruelty and courage, that Alejandro stepped into his home. He had returned earlier than expected from an important meeting, his footsteps echoing through the marble corridor. He loosened his tie, unaware of the storm brewing inside his living room. But the moment he crossed the threshold, his world shifted. He froze. What he saw struck him harder than any boardroom betrayal, harder than any financial loss. His wife, poised yet furious, stood with venom in her words. His maid, trembling but unyielding, shielded his daughter. And his little girl, red-faced and shaking, clung to Maria as if she were her only lifeline. For Alejandro, time seemed to stop. He had built his empire by reading people, by sensing lies, by noticing details others missed. Yet here, in his own home, in the place where love should have been most abundant, he realized he had been blind. The polished image of his perfect life cracked open before his eyes, revealing a truth he had never allowed himself to see. His wealth sparkled outside, but his daughter's tears stained the inside. His wife radiated elegance, but her heart was colder than the marble floor she stood upon. And the only person who seemed to understand love in its truest form was the maid, an outsider who had stepped into fire not for money, not for recognition, but for the sake of a crying child. It was in that instant that Alejandro's soul was shaken to its core. The silence that once filled his mansion was no longer empty. It was deafening, a soundless scream demanding that he face what he had long ignored. And though he had faced countless battles in his career, none felt as urgent. as personal, as devastating as the one waiting before him now. For the first time in years, Alejandro questioned what victory truly meant. In the days that followed that heartbreaking discovery, Alejandro became a silent observer in his own home. A man once consumed by boardroom battles and financial conquests, now found himself studying the subtle rhythms of domestic life, the way voices rose or fell, the way eyes softened or hardened, the way a child's laughter either bloomed or withered. He watched without announcing his presence, and in that quiet, the truth unraveled before him like a confession etched into every gesture. Elena, his wife, carried herself with the polished grace of a woman who had mastered appearances. Her heels clicked sharply on the marble. Her words were clipped, efficient, and cold, and her tolerance for Sophia's innocent mistakes was painfully short. When a glass of juice spilled, her scolding pierced the air like shattering crystal. When Sophia's small hands fumbled with her toys, Elena's sigh of annoyance was louder than any scream. Love, the very thing a child needs most, was absent from her touch, her voice, her presence. Alejandro realized then that for too long he had excused these sharp edges, telling himself they were moments of stress, temporary frustrations. But when observed in silence, they were not isolated. They were a pattern, a harsh truth that he could no longer ignore. And yet, in the same house, another presence painted a very different story. Maria, the maid who came from humble beginnings, filled the mansion with a quiet light Elena could never provide. She became the gentle rhythm in Sophia's day, singing songs while folding laundry, humming lullabies when the child grew restless, and weaving joy into the smallest of moments. Her hands were rough from years of labor, yet they held Sophia with the tenderness of someone who saw her as more than a responsibility. She read aloud stories with voices that made Sophia giggle. She clapped and danced to silly rhymes, and when the little girl's energy faded, she carried her as though she weighed nothing at all. What Alejandro hadn't known, what revealed itself in Maria's soft persistence, was that her tenderness was born from hardship. She carried within her the memory of a younger brother, born with the same condition as Sophia, whom she had once fought fiercely to protect from cruelty. The echoes of those battles had carved strength into her soul, and she had vowed never again to let a child endure what her brother had faced. In Sophia, she saw both innocence and vulnerability, and with each passing day, she guarded her with the devotion of family. Watching from the shadows, Alejandro noticed something he had missed for months: his daughter's laughter returning. Not the forced giggles he sometimes heard in Elena's presence, but the pure, bubbling joy of a child who felt safe and loved. It wasn't wealth that brought that sound back, nor the prestige of his empire. It was the simple, selfless kindness of a woman who owed him nothing, who had no fortune or status, but who gave Sophia everything she had, her heart. And in those moments, Alejandro understood that love could not be bought, commanded, or faked. It could only be given freely, and Maria the maid had given it without hesitation. The breaking point arrived on an afternoon bathed in sunlight, when Alejandro walked through the familiar glass doors and heard the raised tones that once again targeted his daughter. Sophia had spilled a glass of juice across the dining table, the liquid spreading like a tiny river across the polished wood. It was an innocent accident, nothing more than a child's clumsy moment. Yet Elena's voice cracked through the air like thunder. "Useless child! Can't you do anything right?" She snapped, her words sharp enough to wound. Sophia's face crumpled, tears welling in her wide eyes as she froze in fear. But before Elena could lash out again, Maria was there. She knelt beside Sophia, shielding her small frame with her own body, her arms forming a wall of safety. Her voice was steady, quiet, but firm as she told the trembling girl, "It's okay, sweetheart. Everyone spills sometimes." It was then that Alejandro could no longer remain a silent observer. His footsteps echoed with purpose as he entered the room, his presence impossible to ignore. Elena turned, startled, expecting her husband's usual indifference, or perhaps even his agreement. But what she saw was not the calm, calculating businessman she was used to. Alejandro's expression was different, hard with anger, but also raw with something deeper, a protective fire she had never seen before. His voice rang out, low but unshakable. "Enough, Elena." The room fell silent, the kind of silence that follows the shattering of glass. For the first time, Alejandro did not excuse her cruelty as stress or misunderstand it as frustration. He named it for what it was: neglect, heartlessness, betrayal, not only to him as a husband, but far worse to his daughter as a mother. The confrontation ripped the veil off their marriage. All the glossy photos, the elegant appearances at parties, the polished image of success, they were nothing more than a facade hiding a hollow truth. Elena sputtered with excuses, claiming she had only been teaching Sofia discipline, that Maria had exaggerated her role, that Alejandro was overreacting. But Alejandro had already seen enough. He had watched the pattern unfold with his own eyes, seen his daughter's spirit shrink in Elena's presence and bloom in Maria's care. In that moment, he chose with absolute clarity. He would no longer sacrifice his daughter's happiness for the illusion of a perfect marriage. The decision did not come without pain. A man who had fought his way to wealth understood the cost of loss better than most. But this time the price of staying blind was too high. He ended the facade not with shouting or fury, but with finality. "I will not allow you to harm her again," he told Elena, his tone final as stone. The woman who had once dazzled him with beauty and elegance now looked small before the truth. Her power stripped away by the very thing she lacked: compassion. Their marriage began to crumble, the cracks too deep to mend. Alejandro, however, did not look back. In the days that followed, change swept through the mansion like a cleansing wind. Maria was no longer treated as the help. Alejandro gave her recognition, security, and respect, not because of duty, but because she had earned it through the strength of her heart. She became Sofia's official caregiver, but more than that, she became family. Sofia thrived under her care. The timid, tearful child who once cowered in silence now laughed again, her giggles echoing through the sunlit halls, brightening corners of the mansion that had long felt cold. She played, she sang, she danced with the freedom of a child who felt safe. Her bond with Maria grew unbreakable, woven together by love, trust, and the promise that she would never face cruelty alone again. For Alejandro, this transformation was more powerful than any business victory. He had spent years building an empire of glass and steel, measuring success in profits and accolades. But Maria, the woman who once swept his floors and folded his linens, taught him the lesson he had never learned in boardrooms: that true wealth was not built on possessions or status, but on kindness, courage, and love. She, not he, had been the true protector of his daughter. She, not Elena, had shown him what family really meant. And he realized then that the greatest hero in his story was not the millionaire, nor the elegant wife who wore pearls, but the quiet maid whose bravery saved a child's spirit. As weeks turned into months, Alejandro often found himself pausing to watch his daughter's laughter spill into the air. That laughter was priceless, more valuable than every dollar in his bank account. It was proof that he had chosen correctly, that love had triumphed where wealth could not. And each time Sofia's hand slipped into Maria's, he felt gratitude, deep in his bones, for the woman who had entered his life as a servant, yet revealed herself as the heart of his home. This story does not end with riches or prestige. It ends with a truth that should guide every soul, that titles, fortunes, and appearances mean nothing if kindness is absent. Alejandro's empire could command power, but Maria's courage commanded respect. He had once believed his legacy would be the company he built, the fortune he amassed. But standing in the quiet glow of his daughter's joy, he understood his true legacy would be love, the kind that saves, the kind that protects, the kind that leaves a mark on hearts, not balance, sheets. So let this story remind us all, the real measure of a life is not what we own, but what we give. Sometimes the bravest heroes are not the ones with wealth or titles, but those with open hearts who choose compassion when it matters most. Maria was such a hero. And because of her, Sofia's laughter returned, Alejandro's eyes were opened, and a family was rebuilt not on marble or gold, but on love.